really looking forward to going through a huge amount over this series. Really, it's something that we've been wanting to do for quite some time. On a plus note, we've been extremely busy working with a number of individuals to help them obviously secure their next step in multiple different areas. So it's really just looking, the Career Chat series is really going to be about focusing on individuals, looking at the core challenges that everyone faces in the job market now, how the job market has changed in the last 18, 24 months, and really giving people that insight into what's really going to make sure that they can overcome those challenges and not fall victim to them, if you like. And unfortunately, there's a huge amount of unknowns out there at the minute when it comes to actually the job market, because it has changed so radically in such a short space of time. And ultimately, an awful lot of people don't realise the challenges that maybe were there previously. So there's a huge amount that we're really going to be looking into. So today is going to very much focus in on the CV side, which I'm really excited to we'll get going now in a moment to go into. Obviously, there's a large amount that has to happen in a job search process. There's a number of pieces of the jigsaw that have to fit together in a very specific sequence for it all to go well. But once you understand that process, once you understand what has to happen, when it has to happen, and how it has to happen, it becomes an awful lot easier. So an awful lot of the focus will be, of course, today on the CV side, which of course isn't the first piece to the job search process, but it's probably one of the biggest parts that people worry about. About 80% of professionals would say that actually they'd be quite insecure about how good their CV writing ability would be. So it's a very big place to start, and it actually feeds into all of the other areas of a job search process, which is why we want to take it on first, give everyone that bit of insight, and then it actually makes the rest of the process much easier, which is actually how we work with our clients as well. We start with the CV, and then we start building out the other parts. So we'll just get going now in another about 10-15 seconds, just give a couple more people who are maybe just logging on to jump in, and then we can go through things in a bit more detail. Alrighty, so in terms of a CV, I guess ultimately if we look at what a CV is and what it's for, there's probably a misconception as to the whole point of a CV, and ultimately what a CV is there for is to get you an interview. After that, an interview process has begun. It's there as a backup to what's discussed in the interviews and everything else, but ultimately it is your door opener. It's one of the first things that people put a focus onto. Yes, there's other things that come into the process, whether it be cover letters, LinkedIn, etc., but they are actually byproducts of the CV. And so the CV is such a crucial piece, which is why we want to start with it. But it's making sure you get that right and understanding the fundamentals of it. But ultimately you need to understand what it's about, why it's there, why it's important, and how it actually can help you. So right now there's a misconception probably in the market that CVs are maybe a bit outdated, that they are not as important as they used to be. And we were following that kind of track probably about 2 years ago. They've become a central point of any job search process. And one of the big problems in the market now is we've actually entered into an age where it's very digitally focused. We've moved very much away from emailing your CV in and everything else. Everything is managed through applicant tracking systems, or ATSs, which is automated systems. And essentially what you're trying to now combat is being able to appeal to a machine, for want of better phrasing, in terms of the automated system. You're then trying to appeal to a HR professional who would be the next in line to review your CV. And then you're trying to actually appeal to the hiring manager, the person that you're probably going to be working for. So there's 3 different audiences that one document has to appeal to, and that becomes a very difficult place to be. So a huge amount of what we do is focusing in on how we go about that. And there's a massive struggle for people where CVs, of course, you want them to look great, you of course want them to read great, but ultimately when we boil it down, and if we go back to the point I made a moment ago of what a CV is there for, it's there to get you an interview. So it has to be functional. So unless it's functional, it's not going to get you where you need it to be. And to be functional, it has to hit the core points that are required. Essentially the checkbox exercise that has to happen from the applicant tracking system or automated systems point of view, which is, do you fulfill the certain criteria that has been set out within the business to ultimately do the role? So that's what we're going to look at today. You'll have to forgive my reverse writing ability. It's not going to be as easy to walk through in a whiteboard setting or anything else. But if we take a standard CV, and I've mocked up a quick thing on a whiteboard just to quickly show you what it would look like. But essentially in any CV format, you're always going to have your personal or contact information at the start, which ties into not just, of course, people would have their full name, address and everything else. There's sometimes we sometimes over divulge in terms of the level of information we give. We don't need to go into in-depth detail about our personal details. All we need to provide in any contact information at the start of any CV is full name, address, contact information in terms of your email, phone number, and any social media sites, LinkedIn being a prime example. But ultimately, if you're more, let's say, digitally focused in terms of digital marketing or more creative, and you want to showcase some of your, I guess, portfolio that you want to bring forward in any opportunity, to any opportunity, it's very much a case where you need to include that link there as well. After you've established, obviously, your contact information, a lot of people have put in whether their marital status, date of birth, anything else. That's not required. It's something they can't actually request. And specifically in Ireland and England, it's something that we don't need to give. So it's very important not to put that in there and to leave that to one side. Once you've actually input all of your information, you're then moving on to your professional profile, which is the first piece on any CV. It's a couple of lines or a summary that just is located below your contact information, and it's the most underutilized area of a CV. The reason it's so underutilized is because people don't understand what the importance of it is. If we look at today's market, we have one of the most qualified talent pools ever. Right now we have more people out of work and are qualified to the highest possible level than we've ever had before. So it is a very, very competitive market, and that shouldn't dissuade you. There's an awful lot of opportunities coming into the market as well, which is great. So it's more just to understand that that is the case, and that you need to take the reasonable steps to ensure that you can capitalize on all of your experience, all of your ability, all of your skill set. So within your professional profile, it's very, very important not only to highlight your skills, not only to highlight your experience or your education. It's actually more about bringing your personality across, because if we have 7 seconds, which is the market average right now, to grab somebody's attention, the majority of their time is going to be spent in that professional profile. In fact, 80% of their time that they spend on your CV is going to be at the top of, or at the spent in that area. So if we can reasonably expect that the majority of the people applying for the same roles that you are have the same skills, same experience, and the same education, then what's the difference? Well, the difference is actually you. You bring something different. Your personality, your approach, how you've encountered similar experiences and how you have managed to grow from them, bring different skill sets, etc., etc. So there's a huge amount that actually is a difference between you and others. And it's trying to convey that in a very short and concise way that grabs somebody's attention and makes them and compels them to read through your CV. And that, there is a bit of an art to that, and that is a huge amount of focus work that we put in for all of our clients. So it's very, very important to really have a professional profile, understand what it is, understand how it works, and make sure that you convey as much as you can, not just about your skills, not just about your experience, and not just about your education, but also about you as a person and what you bring that's different and the value that you'll bring to the role. After that, a lot of people would naturally jump to having maybe their education or whatever it may be. You should actually be going into your key skills and competencies. And what that really means is it's typically an area where you have buzzwords, for want of better phrasing. And the buzzwords really focus in on, if you're in sales, you're going to look at business development and so on. If you're in technology, it might be certain technologies that you use, whether it's Microsoft Stacks, or if you're in multiple other sources, whether it's operations or anything else in terms of process, procedure, all that sort of stuff. There's a huge amount that you want to include in there. It works twofold. So one, the skills and experience, the key skills and competencies work, one, because they'll get the recruiter, hiring manager, etc., will get an immediate insight to really understand what type of skills you bring to the role. But secondly, and one of the big things that people don't realize is, and when they get that unfortunately inevitable email at times from different recruiters or companies they've applied to, we'll keep your CV on file, we'll come back at some point in the future if we feel a role suits your skill set. A lot of the time, it's not that they actually aren't interested in your skill set. It's that, and because they haven't come back to you, it's actually because they can't find you in their database of hundreds of thousands of people, because they run very specific searches trying to find the right candidates. So if you don't have that skills and expertise section on your CV, it becomes very, very difficult for you to be identified in any future processes and to be shortlisted in any future process. So it's really, really important to have it in there. After that, let's grab some water and hopefully let some of those points sink in. Thanks very much for all the questions. A few of those I will ask as we're going through, and a few we'll obviously deal with at the end. One that's popping up at the moment is, should it be in Word or PDF format? Word is always better unless you're asked for PDF. So just to give you a bit of insight on that. In terms of how many CVs you should have, you can have multiple different CVs. Ultimately, you don't want to have thousands of them. You should have, depending upon the areas, a lot of our focus really works with people on narrowing their focus and making sure that they don't broaden their approach too much, because that ultimately washes down your experience and your skill set and actually makes it harder to secure a job. So being more focused on your specific outcome, the types of jobs you want, actually really helps. So 2 to 3 different versions depending upon the roles that you're going for, and you slightly tweak them based upon the opportunity and the required skill set that you're looking for. So following on from that and following on from your skills and expertise, normally you would have, after that, you would have your qualifications or your education. This is probably one of the most debated areas, and it's a question I did see come up a moment ago, which was, where should that position be in terms of your education? Should it be at the top of your CV? Should it be at the bottom? And it's been debated by loads of different career experts and multiple others. One of the big things that you need to focus in on is actually what story you're trying to tell. If you've recently graduated, then your education is going to be vital to you securing your next role. If you've recently returned to study, and specifically return to study to go and take it the next step in your career, and you require that education or that qualification, then it's absolutely vital that that's at the top of your CV. However, if you've been working for the last 20 years, you haven't returned to study, other than internal courses or anything else that you don't feel would add value to your profile, it's more your actual experience, which is absolutely fine. That's a huge amount of people in the market. The experience factor is much bigger than the education because of the role that they're in. Your education doesn't need to be front and center. It should be lower down on your CV. So there is, for this thing of having right and wrong answers to it, it shouldn't be right and wrong. There's no right and wrong answer to it. It depends upon what story you're trying to tell. If you're trying to convey your recent education, it should be at the top. If you're trying to convey your recent experience in terms of your actual professional experience, that should be front and center. Which would then bring you on to the next point, which is very much around your experience, which is number 4 on the CV point, is looking at then, what do you actually include in your experience, in your career history? An awful lot of people tend to sway towards just putting a name of the company, the dates they were there, and then ultimately the responsibilities that they had in the role. While responsibilities are important, the responsibilities can be taken from a job spec that you received when you initially came into the role. It doesn't give me as a recruiter or a hiring manager or anyone else that's looking at your CV an insight into what you achieved in that role. And that's ultimately what I'm trying to find out. If I'm looking at your CV and trying to hire somebody into a job, that's what I'm trying to find out. And that's ultimately what all of the recruiters out there, talent acquisition people, HR, hiring managers, etc., they're all trying to find out, yes, you did the job for an extended amount of time, but what did you achieve in the role? So in your experience and in your career history, you should have a structure in a very simplistic manner, which is you should have 1 to 2 lines about who the business are, because not everybody knows who all the businesses are unless you work for a global firm. And even then, there's multiple different aspects of a global organization. There's multiple different functions and so on. So it's really important to have 1 to 2 lines about the business, 1 to 2 lines about your role, and also 4 to 3, on average 3 to 5, especially if it's recent experience, it should be 5 bullet points on your achievements or what you delivered in that role. Because ultimately what they're trying to assess from anyone's CV before they bring you forward for an interview is very much trying to understand whether you can add additional value to their team and ultimately to the business. There's another one coming in here now, sorry. Does every CV need a cover letter? Yes, it does in today's day and age. A lot of people will say you don't require a cover letter. If they specify you don't, that's no problem, but you should always have a cover letter because it gives you the opportunity to do an overview document. One of the things that we do talk about quite regularly with people is that a lot of people send in an email and attach a cover letter and then also attach a CV. Well, really, if we, I suppose, bring that back a step, you should really just have the cover letter in the email. That is your email that you're sending to say, this is who I am, this is what I do, because if they want to open an attachment, they're just going to go straight to your CV anyway. So it's very, very important to, of course, have a cover letter unless they specify otherwise, because it does give you a high level view of your experience. And we will go into cover letters on our next series, but it's a good point to bring up at this moment in time. So one of the other things that we want to look at within within your career experience, and it's something that people do tend to struggle with, whether they've been working out of the home for a certain period, whether they've taken a career break, whether they've returned to education for a certain period, is actually how do you explain a career gap or a year out of the chosen industry that you're in. And very much there is simplistic ways to do it. Ultimately, you got to be obviously honest at the same time, and it's not about embellishing things or anything else, but there is very simplistic ways, which is simply putting in the time period that you were out and what you did actually accomplish in that time frame. So what were you doing? I've never seen someone discarded from a process or removed from a process or not considered for an opportunity because they took a certain time out for one reason or another. If someone took a time out to look after their family, whatever that may look like, if someone took out time for education, whatever that was focusing on, that's all really important stuff because they are life experiences that all have a role to play within your own value and what you bring to the table. So it's about calling them out, the time period that you had it for, and also what you were doing during that time. So it is really important to call them out as part of your experience. When looking at your experience, an awful lot of people list everything that they have done, which is fine and understandable, especially if it's a case whereby you have shorter experience. So let's say you've only been working for the last 5 years. However, if you've been working for an awful lot longer than that, so 10, 15 plus, etc., there is an important piece on your CV called the additional experience section. A lot of people don't use it, and unfortunately it does come down to a fact where you're just over divulging on your CV. It makes it too long, you're trying to include too much information. You got to remember, the CV, coming back to the point I made at the very beginning, the CV is about getting you an interview. If that information is not going to help get you an interview, you don't need to worry about it. It should be there and present, but it doesn't have to be a central point. It doesn't have to be something you put an awful lot of effort into, which would bring you down to really the next point down, which of course is the additional experience, and is located just below experience in general. All you're going to include in that section is the job title you held, the company you worked for, and the dates you were there. That's it. You don't include any bullet points about what you did. You don't include anything about the company or anything else. Typically, you would only use that strategy if you have more than 10 years experience across multiple different organizations. The reason why you do that and the reason why that happens and the reason why it's important to do it, should I say, is because the additional experience is, when it's outside of 10 years, what the assumption is by any hiring manager is if you haven't done it throughout the last 10 years, you would either have used those skills again that you learned 10 years ago in some other role and they've been mentioned somewhere else on your CV, or if you haven't used them in the last 10 years, you will have to retrain in some capacity. While you won't be a novice at it and have to retrain completely, you will have to ultimately retrain. So therefore, the value that they bring to the role is minimal, and therefore there's no need to include them or to take up space on your CV. So the idea there is that under the additional experience banner, you're simply including the role that you held, the name of the company, and the dates that you were there. Finally, after that, you're then moving into one of the areas, it's probably a very big question for an awful lot of people, is around additional skills as well as such as languages or into interests, hobbies, and everything else. There is a constant debate around whether you should be including hobbies and everything else. There, again, coming back to something I mentioned earlier on, I've never seen anyone removed from a process, and I've been involved in thousands of interview panels at this point, involved in thousands of interview processes. I've never ever seen anyone removed from a panel or from a process because they had included their hobbies. It gives people an insight into who you are, what you like, what you can bring to the table, why there's an importance to the interests that you have, and how that obviously shapes you as a person, and how you can, of course, add to the culture of an organization. And that's where that really comes in. So it is an important piece. So some people are comfortable sharing that, some people aren't. If you have voluntary experience and that's an area you really want to highlight, that's where that would go, down the bottom of the CV. If your voluntary experience is your work experience or career history, you should include it as part of your actual experience section. So there's a huge amount there. So just to quickly recap on all of that, I know there's a few more that have joined in the last few minutes, so obviously welcome and thanks very much for joining, and hopefully you're starting to get a picture of what we've been talking about so far. Really, when we come back to a CV, ultimately the whole goal of a CV is to get you an interview. If the information that you're supplying in your CV, of course, has to be factual, but if it's not going to get you an interview, then you need to think about why it's in there. The structure of any good CV has your personal information at the beginning, but it should only be about contact information and things that enhance your profile, like your LinkedIn, or links to sites where you hold portfolios of different visual aspects, if you're in graphic design or whatever it may be. Your professional profile is ultimately the most important piece of any CV. You've got 7 seconds to grab somebody's attention. Most of their time spent on your CV is there. They're not going to read the rest of your CV unless you have unless you have a very compelling professional profile. Skills and expertise, listing them out and having them not as bullet points, but simply separated by a comma of your core skills, your key skills. Typically 10 to 15 is perfect in that area. Enhances not only your ability to stand out in the search process when they're searching their automated systems or their systems in general to shortlist you for an opportunity, but also gives them a quick snapshot of the types of skills you bring to the table. Your education can be located at the top of your CV or at the bottom. Either one, it depends upon the story you're telling. So if you're a recent graduate, if you've recently upskilled, if you've recently returned to college while working or taken time out to return to college, it should be very prominent. It should be up the top of your CV before your career history or your career experience. If you've studied 20 years ago and your education is not as relevant now, it should be located down the bottom because it's not needed to obviously secure the job that you're going for. Your career experience should very much only focus on the last 10 years of the work that you've done. Outside of that, everything else should be included in your additional experience section, which is simply an overview of the types of roles that you've held in terms of the job title, company name, and time you've obviously spent with them, i.e. the year and month. In terms of your hobbies, interests, language skills, all that sort of stuff, that should be located again down the bottom. Voluntary experience, unless it was career experience, should be located there also. In terms of your career experience, and to delve into that a small bit more, again, is 2 lines in each part of your CV. So each piece of experience you have and each job you have held, you should have a line to 2 lines about the company, a line to 2 lines about your role, and 3 to 5 bullet points on the deliverables or achievements you had in that. So there's a couple of questions coming in there from Jane and Mariana. So Jane, what are the main things to avoid when writing a CV? It's a really good question. We call it our 5 CV sins. So clear and concise information, of course, at the beginning. But one of the big things that people have is an over personal email address. You'd be surprised at some of the email addresses we have seen on CVs that have been sent into interview processes at very senior level and at junior level. So it's something very simplistic, but it's something that can rule you out of a process quite quickly. So make sure you have a very professional email, not even just a professional, but an email that just simply contains your name and not nicknames as it can be. In terms of other areas to look at, if people flag that they have attention to detail and they are very detail orientated, and then they have spelling mistakes in their CV, I have seen people removed from a process because they're calling out, and it's actually more to do with awareness than to do with their actual spelling or grammar. It's more to the fact that if you're saying you've got really strong attention to detail and you've got spelling mistakes, people actually do rule you out of a process. So it's a really key thing to bring in there. Your professional profile is ultimately one of the big things you've got to bring in there. Don't avoid just putting in your experience, career to date, and skills, because ultimately, if you're going up against 100 applicants, which isn't something that is uncommon in today's market, it is very, very important to bring forward your personality, because ultimately that's what they're going to be looking for. Because one of the big things that's said in the market now is you can train skills, you can train competencies, you cannot train culture into somebody. It's just physically impossible. You either fit with a company culture or you don't. And that's ultimately what they're really trying to look for. So if you can bring forward your personality, while in certain cases that can rule you out of a process, it is better to be ruled out of the process at that point so you can focus your efforts on the right roles for you and the right companies for you where you can flourish, than to go through a very long-winded process ultimately to find out that you weren't successful, which actually has a bigger impact upon your own confidence and everything else. So it's very, very important to bring forward your personality through your professional profile. How long should your CV be? It's actually a really good question, and it's something that's very, very common in the market, and there's a misconception with it. There's this understanding that you should only have maybe 1 page. It was actually more of a resume, which is not something that's used in Ireland or the UK. It's more for other geographical locations. Others assume that you can only have a 2-page CV. That's not true either. Anywhere from 2 to 4 pages is perfect. If it's more than 4 pages, the likelihood is you're not going to get ruled out in most cases, especially if it's obviously you've got 20 odd years experience, but they are, it is going to maybe frustrate the individual if they're looking for a certain piece of information. So it is very, very important to keep it clear, concise, and make sure that you only include the information that is relevant to the job that you're applying for. If you did something 25 years ago or whatever it may be that's no longer relevant, then it shouldn't be in your CV. Again, falls into the additional experience. There's a couple of other questions that we had previously as well around prior to obviously coming live this evening, which was very much around what font should I use, which is something that we get quite often, and you'd be surprised. Calibri is always a very basic one. Times New Roman, don't use it in my opinion. Recruiters, hiring managers, HR people absolutely hate it because they see it every day. So Calibri is a really easy one. I would say Calibri is probably the most logical one to use, or Verdana is the other one, which actually has the least impact in terms of individuals who may have dyslexia or anything else. So it works really well. So either one of those are really, really good. Thanks for the comment, Layla. During the interview, how can I catch the interviewer's attention, or how to start an interview? It's a really good question. It's something we will deal with more in interview tips, which we're going to approach probably in the next 2 to 4 weeks. But while we have you, and just to give you a bit of added value, of course, from it, during an interview, what you're really trying to do is make sure that you showcase your skill set in the right way. So to do that, you're making sure that you're not just listing off your skills or your expertise. It's about you and how you bring those skills and expertise into the role, and the value that that will bring to the business. That's the most important thing. No matter what role you're going into, ultimately they have a budget that they have to account for in any hiring process. They have to they've been allocated a budget for a certain resource that has to deliver certain outcomes for the business, which ultimately results in value for the organization. So ultimately, if you can bring forward that in any interview process, whether you're in sales, operations, technology, digital marketing, whatever it may be, once you can bring across the value that your skill set, your experience, and your personality will bring to any organization, you will stand out from the crowd. Because it's something that is not done in most interviews, specifically if you're not in a sales orientated role. In terms of, there's a couple of other quick questions that we had again coming in, which we have covered an awful lot of. One of the big things, certainly for people maybe working in Ireland for the first time, around the personal information, there's an inclination to include, again, personal details, just to re-highlight that around. There's no need to include date of birth. There is no need to include, you're very welcome, Layla. There's no need to include your actual marital status. There's no need to include a picture for any reason. And also, one of the big things that you don't need to include is also around the visa status. So if you've recently, studied here and are now looking for your first job, and you have a current visa status, we are still in a period right now, and it can be a sore subject for some. But one of the big things that we are still fighting against is unconscious bias. And unconscious bias is something that naturally happens in an awful lot of process. Something that shouldn't happen, but it can. And a lot of the time that ties back to when, if people have included a visa because they may think that the client may not, I'm talking specifically about recruitment organisations at this moment in time, where they may not feel their client will be open to taking on someone that requires a visa status because they don't fully understand the process and the simplicity that goes with it, and how easy it is actually to bring the right skill set in. The rest of it is actually simply paperwork, in the same way of bringing any other on. Yes, it requires a few more pieces of paper to do it, but it's not something that actually is very difficult in the way it can be made out. So something just to bear in mind, that when it comes to a visa status or anything else, it's not something that is really important to include at this juncture. Your CV is there to get you an interview. If you're the right person for the role, you have the right skill set, you have the right experience, you have the right personality for the culture, that's all that matters. The rest is actually a administration function, and therefore can be dealt with when or if you get the role. So it's not something that needs to be disclosed. A lot of people unfortunately feel that they need to disclose it up front. It's not something that needs to be done at that juncture. So it's very important just to be aware of these things, be aware that people would automatically make assumptions from a document. And again, coming back to the point I made at the very beginning, is your CV is to get you an interview. Unfortunately, you're now dealing with 3 different audiences before you get called for interview. So one being, of course, an automated system which has a checkbox exercise that you have to appeal to, which is the simplistic version that we went through earlier on of what a CV should look like. You also have to appeal to a HR manager in terms of their checkbox exercise. While they'll have a bit more detail about the role, they are not working in that role on a day-to-day basis. So them being able to identify your skill set and experience, unless you amplify it on your CV and really call out the core competencies that you have that align with the job, they're not going to see it. And then, of course, appealing to the hiring manager who has more detail, insight into the role, who understands it in the more minutiae of detail, and therefore you need to also satisfy their queries that they're going to have. So it's a huge thing that you need to incorporate in that, and there's a huge aspect to it, and there's 3 different audiences that you need to really appeal to. So it's making sure you can balance all of those areas. One of the big things that I can't stress enough is a lot of people will always go for a more visual appealing CV. The problem with a visually appealing CV is that, unfortunately, applicant tracking systems or automated systems are not equipped to be able to manage a CV like that. They can't read the information. Everything gets skewed when your application pulls through, although you don't see it on your end. When it's received by the hiring person, whether that's talent acquisition, HR, recruitment individual, or the hiring manager themselves, it looks all over the place. And unfortunately, when you're talking about hundreds of applicants coming in, unless it's structured in the right way, it's very important unless it's structured in the right way, they're not going to call you for interview. So it's very important to make sure that it's simplistic, it's straightforward, and they can easily call out the core areas. There's a couple of ones coming in there. Should you add references to your CV? And it's a very common question. It's something we get all the time. But ultimately, an awful lot of people still supply references on their CV because it was something that was implemented in the market a number of years ago, and not just here. So actually, no, you shouldn't, especially in today's age, because what you're doing is, one, GDPR, you're giving away someone's personal information. In most cases, it is their personal mobile and personal email that you're giving. Some cases not, but a lot of cases it is. So you shouldn't actually be doing it. 2, you're giving away a very important piece of information, and that's not needed at this point. References are only applicable when you've actually secured a job. It's at that point that references then have to be checked to back up everything that's been seen in the interview process to date. So it's only at that point that it's applied, and that's all. That's when that needs to happen. Are these tips mainly for office-based roles, or will they work for manual labour roles also? It's a really good question. One of the big things is actually coming into manual labour now, and more, let's say, trade-driven roles, is actually these are becoming more common to have in terms of CVs, in terms of cover letters. A lot of the time it wasn't really needed because it was actually more focused on who you know and the relationship aspect of it, which is great. But as we start to see the building sector and also multiple other trade sectors really increase, it's becoming more common. And the benefit behind this now is because this is so common in office-based roles or whatever it may be, and multiple others. It's actually, by taking that step now, and we've multiple experiences with it in terms of people working in haulage or whatever it may be. We've had someone that's received 10 job offers in the space of 2 weeks because they actually took the time to do their LinkedIn profile, to do a CV, to do a cover letter, and really have it set up in such a way where it calls out their experience and their expertise. And because it's not that common in that sector, it made them jump to the top of the queue and the top of every shortlist that was available for their specific role in their specific area. And they still get calls now, 6 to 12 months later, after securing the job, with constant offers, which is a really nice place to be, considering they have a job, they're happy in it, but they know there's multiple other offers. And especially when you've gone from a period for that individual where they were out of role for 6 months before we started dealing with them. So it's a really important question, and I really appreciate it being brought up, because actually having a CV, having a cover letter, having a LinkedIn is not just for people that are office based. If you do that now in more trade focused sectors, whether that's building, whether it's carpentry, or whatever it may be, you'll actually stand out from the crowd an awful lot quicker because there are less people doing it in that area. I think that is all the questions that we've had. If I've missed any, I'll give another minute there just to ping them back in. I think I've covered all of them. Hopefully I have, and hopefully found this really important. But just to sum up, again, the key tips: have clear your communication, or your contact information, should I say, is simply located at the top of your CV. Don't go into too much detail. Have your professional profile, not just your experience, not just your skills, not just your education, but ultimately bring through your personality. Of course, include your experience, but only experience that is relevant to the job and specifically that's happened in the last 10 years. Make sure to include, to group everything else under additional experience. Keep everything else in terms of hobbies, interests, voluntary experience, unless it was to do with your career, in the bottom section at the section at the bottom of your CV. Another question there, sorry. If I don't receive a reply to my job application, should I contact the organisation again and ask why? Absolutely. Not enough people follow up. And again, I throw out loads of statistics, of course, but of course this is what comes out in the market, is anywhere from 75 to 85% of recruiters would say they prefer when people follow up. And the reason being is because if you're getting 120 CVs for every job you post, and on average a recruiter will work, or a HR person will be working on a minimum of 5 jobs per week as an absolute minimum, that's 500 CVs they have to go through. You know, if it's 120, it's obviously 600. So if that's the level of CVs, documents you're trying to work through for different skill sets, different experience, etc., it's so important to follow up, because it is so difficult for them. And while they are, you know, it's not about feeling bad for them, it's more just about knowing that it's very difficult for them to see the wood through the trees. So following up, re-highlighting your CV, and then a lot of the time, as soon as you get off the call, resending your CV there and then, to make sure that they've got it, they've read it, and that there is a follow-up action, i.e. a call the following week, or a meeting, or whatever it may be. If you haven't heard back, again, follow up. There is nothing wrong with following up. You can't be afraid to follow up with people, whether you've sent them their CV or anything else. You've taken the time to send your CV or interview or whatever it may be. You have taken time to apply for that role. They've put the role out there for applications. You should not feel bad about following up on your application, because it's important to you. And if they haven't responded to you, they should have, because that is the ultimate process of it. You apply. If you're not successful, you either hear that you're not successful, or you hear you are successful and you're moving to the next stage. But that's the process. It shouldn't be this thing which unfortunately has come into the market as an acceptable standard, which it's not, which is just leaving people hanging and not responding to them. So thanks very much for that question. That was a really important one from James Gardner. So I had a second interview and it's been nearly a week. Should I contact them to chase up or sit tight? Absolutely chase up. Within a week, always. Simple email, just say, really enjoyed meeting you last week. Would love to have a follow-up conversation or an update as to where the next step is, or what the next step is, should I say, or the update on my my process. in terms of am I moving forward, am I not moving forward, etc. So absolutely follow up. Typically an email would suffice because it's harder to get in contact with people now unless you have the direct line. So an email should be okay. If you do have the number, of course, do give them a call. Always makes it easier, makes it a quicker turnaround, and you're not, again, left hanging for it. So really appreciate all the comments, really appreciate all of the questions, really appreciate all the engagement. Thank you very, very much. This is obviously our maiden voyage on the on Instagram Live. We will be doing an awful lot more of these moving forward. For us, it's really about making sure we remove any ambiguity around the job search process, show you all of the different pieces of the jigsaw and how they fit together so you can accelerate your process. And ultimately, an awful lot of the work that we're going to be doing on these sessions and walking through with people is the work that we do one-to-one with our clients. Obviously, it's a bit more bespoke, it's more, there's more detail, and of course, there's only a certain amount we can cover in half an hour with on these sessions, but they will give you a huge amount of insight that will really help you take that next step. I'd be more than happy to share the overall structure of a CV, so please don't hesitate to, don't obviously put it into the comments, but certainly message us afterwards with your email address and phone number if you want to have a follow-up conversation, or if you just simply want the CV template that is proven to work with all of the applicant tracking systems out there, that's proven to get much higher engagement than any visually aesthetic CV that can be concocted. And we'd be delighted to share it with you. So please don't hesitate to message on your email address, and we'll be happy to share that with you through private messaging. And ultimately, we're going to be running these every 2 weeks. So our next stage, we're going to be looking at the cover letter side, which will be feeding on from this. We'll also be looking at LinkedIn, interview techniques, whether that's first stage interview and second stage interview, as well as how to negotiate the right offer. And then ultimately, what the follow-on steps is when you secure a job, because securing a job is excellent and it's a huge achievement, but ultimately then the next step thereafter is actually the probation period that you then have to navigate through, and there's an awful lot of things that come with that, so we also will put a bit of time into that. So really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and look forward to seeing you at the next session.